Good afternoon. Thank you for joining another installment of Reasonable Faith monthly International Directors Book Study. We have been working through a very easy read, Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology, and we have had the pleasure of having the authors of that book join us every month. Just quick introductions to some key figures on the call. We have with us Charles Honeycutt. He's a regional director for Reasonable Faith, an amazing man. Part of the reason why this has been successful is because of his great connection. So we're so thankful for him. My name is John. I'm a Reasonable Faith director here in Southern Colorado. And our guest speaker is Professor Maydole. Professor Maydole is a professor emeritus at Davidson College. And in chapter 10, he's the one that wrote on what is known as the ontological argument for the existence of God. So today, the sheet you see on the screen is for Professor Maydole. So with no further ado, Professor, please take it away.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. And what I thought we might want to do is I prepared a brief handout. One of the things about the ontological argument is that my handout disappeared. There it is. One thing that is interesting about this argument, it's sometimes difficult to get into. And so what I thought I would do is I have here on the screen, you're seeing a very brief statement of one of the first formulators of that argument is by the name of St. Anselm of Canterbury. And it can be put rather succinctly: we can conceive of God as a being than which no greater can be conceived. And we think that way of God sometimes. God is the all-perfect being, the being without any limitations or flaws, who is omniscient, omnipotent, all-powerful, all good. In other words, no greater than which can even be conceived. And Anselm had this view that if you existed in reality, you had a property that was great-making. It actually added to what it is that something is, and that's greater than just existing in the mind alone. So what he's saying is that if God really does exist, then he's greater than if he only existed in the mind or in the imagination of human being. And because if he didn't, then you could think of something which was greater than God, if he didn't exist in reality. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Therefore, God does exist in reality. In other words, it's inconsistent to say that something is the greatest possible, but I can think of something which is even greater. Therefore, God has to, if on the assumption that God didn't exist, you would get a contradiction. That's the basic argument. Now, you mentioned the other day in an email, I think, Charles, that you would, that a lot of the viewers here would have been familiar with this argument. And I don't know how familiar they were or are with parodies of the argument. And you have any sense of that?
I think the greatest conceivable island or the greatest conceivable pizza has been batted around by people that would be interested in this discussion. In
the discussions you've had so far?
Yeah.
In your group?
I think the average person that's going to show some interest in this argument is going to understand some of the parodies.
Okay, well then we can move quickly. But now this fellow monk named Gonilio introduced the idea that, well, if Anselm is right, then why wouldn't that same kind of reasoning justify the claim that an most perfect island exists, an island that had illimitable wealth and riches associated with it. And it's the same pattern, the same logic, the same structure of reasoning that Anselm is used by Gonilio to establish that this perfect lost island exists. So the question is that enough to discredit Anselm's argument? What do you guys think?
I don't think so.
Why not?
The distinction that I would draw are material properties and immaterial properties between God and an island. That's what I think of right off the top of my head.
Yeah, and I really think that some of our viewers are going to occupy a continuum of familiarity with these types of concepts. And so I would love for you to really walk us through why this parody doesn't work. Because some of our viewers, this might be the first time they engage with this type of material.
Right. Well, in order to be able to do that, what one has to really do is break the arguments down into bits and pieces, and to which I didn't do on this handout, but I do in the article, the chapter, and in a way, I'm sorry that I didn't include it on the handout, but that's okay. But what we have here is that an argument is said to be a good one if it's valid, namely, and that means if the premises of the argument imply the conclusion of the argument. More specifically, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. That's usually how we describe an argument when we say that it's valid. Secondly, it has to be sound. And that means that the premises of the argument have to be true, or at least particularly well justified. And that if that's the case, then the conclusion, if the argument's valid, would follow from the premises. So, and it turns out that Gonilio's argument is just as good as Anselm's when looked at from the point of view of validity itself. And it appears as if, at least on the surface, that Gonilio's argument is just as good as Anselm's argument when it comes to validity. Then the question becomes, well, what about the premises? Are they true? Are the premises of Anselm's argument true? Are the premises of Gonilio's argument true? Or if you don't know for sure, are the premises of Gonilio's argument as justifiable, the reasons we have for supporting those truths or those claims as truth, are they as justifiable as the ones for Anselm? And what I did in the paper was to lay out the premises and the conclusion of each of them very, very carefully. And it looks a little convoluted because there are built-in assumptions here, such as that we can have an idea of God and that idea makes sense. And Anselm says, well, we have, God exists in the mind alone. If that were the case, then you would get a contradiction. But unless you can show that there's something with Anselm's argument, Gonilio's argument, which is different from Anselm's, then you're stuck with saying Anselm's argument is a bad argument. And then what would that difference be? I argued in the paper on this chapter that Anselm's argument was sound and that Gonilio's argument was not, because he made, and because there was a certain premise in Gonilio's argument which turned out to be false. or so I thought, when I unpacked the argument in its logical detail, which I do in the chapter here, but it's a little hard to do that. Well, we could do it on the screen, but I'd be spending a lot of time just going through it. Unless people have the book in front of them, they could see it themselves. So it was an argument that I had, Gonilio's argument and Anselm's argument had 7 assumptions. I thought the fourth assumption was, now when I say that it has it, it's not obvious that it has it. You have to read through this. You have to reconstruct the argument. So many people state their claims, but they have these insights and intuitions, but they don't state all of the stuff that's necessary in order to make the argument a good argument, in order to make the argument a valid argument. They overlook things. They think it's either too obvious or they don't think about it at all. They just intuit it. I tried to lay out all those assumptions using the principle of charity, trying to make the argument as strong as possible. And it turned out that you can see that the 2 arguments between Gonilio and Anselm are identical, except for what looked like the 4th premise. And after I wrote this piece, or even right after I wrote this piece, which another philosopher by the name of Graham Oppe wrote a reply in which he argued that even if Maydole reconstructs the argument the way he does, Gonilio's argument still refutes Anselm's argument. And that what I thought, that's me thinking, if I thought that one of Gonilio's premises was false, namely the premise which said, and I'll read it out to you now. It's not printed on the screen here, but it's almost printed. You can look at if you go down to the screen a little bit where it says a repair to the argument. All right, there's this premise here. Let's stop there, which says that, and I called it A4 for short. It is conceivable that something is greater than anything that lacks a great making property that it conceivably has. Now, at that point, I had a period, right? And Gonilio steps in and replies, that's the same as, from my point of view, as saying it is conceivable that some island is greater than anything that lacks a great making property for islands that it conceivably has. And I thought that statement by Gonilio was false, and that Anselm's corresponding statement for beings in general was true. And I even gave an argument for why I thought Anselm's was true and why I thought Gonilio's was false. That would have been enough to discredit Anselm by Gonilio, okay? That was the idea. And I had reasons for why I said Anselm's is true and Gonilio's was not, but I could deal with some of those in the article. But what happened was, I read this Oppe piece, Graham Oppe, a philosopher from Australia. You might know of him, Charles. I don't know about you, James, whether you've heard of him before, but he's a really great philosopher. He would be the nemesis. He's my nemesis in a way. But he showed that these arguments are so identical that anything you could use to support the Anselm's argument could likewise be used to support Gonilio's. And then it occurred to me that I had overlooked something. And what I overlooked was the idea that God, all of God's essential properties that God has to have by virtue of his or her very nature, I call them great making properties that are better to have than otherwise, better to have than not. So, for example, intelligence could be thought of as a great making property. It's better to be intelligent than otherwise. Goodness could be a great making property. It's better to be good than bad or otherwise. I think all of God's essential properties, in order to be the kind of being that he is or she is, have to be great-making properties. Can't be anything essentially bad with God. But what about islands, however? Are all of the essential properties of being an island great-making properties? Well, in order to be an island, for one, you have to be material. You have to be capable, and material things are capable of coming into existence and going out of existence. That's not the kind of property that God's supposed to have if God exists. You can't bring God into existence. You can't make God go out of existence. God's all powerful, so you can't do that. And so it occurred to me that God is the kind of being, all of whose essential properties are great-making, but that's not true of islands. And when you build that into the argument by adding an additional premise to Anselm's argument, namely A8, an eighth premise in Anselm's argument, you simply say all the essential properties of God, that than which none greater can be perceived, are great-making. You can't say that about islands. Can't say that about human beings. Can't say that about any material objects. Therefore, and you would have to say all essential all essential property for islands are great-making properties, and that's just not true. And therefore, it fails. What's interesting, and I think your readers will really have fun. So I may want to stop there. Any questions so far on that score?
Yeah, this is really, really, really good. For the people at home, I want to remind you that the brilliant man you hear talking is Professor Maydole. Some time ago, he put together a piece for a book called The Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology, and that's what he's discussing with us here today. In that piece, in this argument in its original formation by St. Anselm, as he discussed above, it was an argument that said if it's even possible that God exists, then God has to exist if you understand what it means for a being to be maximally great. It was a really controversial thing for a long, long time, and still is in many circles. And Professor Maydole has so courageously helped us address that today. And he's talking about how people over the years have attempted to attack this idea by saying, well, if that applies to God, why doesn't it apply to other things? One of the questions I have, Professor, is I suppose, first, let me say, I find it very, very interesting how you chose to present your refutation of one of the parodies, in that you approached it not so much on the level of saying, well, it's not satisfactory to the original concept, so much as to say it doesn't stand up under the weight of its own merit. Like, it's not making valid inferences. Some of the premises are false. I hadn't thought to approach it that way. But what I do think, though, I've heard people criticize some of the parodies by saying there's no such thing as a maximally great island. Like, it's not really a coherent concept. And they talk about things like there's no objective superlatives to islands, right? Like, some of these things are very subjective about what makes an island great, and those things are kind of fluid depending on who you're talking to. I suppose one question I would have is how does God not fall prey to the same type of objection, where someone might say, well, maximal greatness, even in a moral sense, to some people, is there any subjective fluidity to that? Like, is there really objective superlatives that apply to God that don't apply to other things?
Well, sure. I mean, look, I mean, whatever God is in totality, we don't know what, we don't, I'm going to say we don't know what all those things are. And so But what it seems to me that we can be reasonably sure of here, because this is how we conceive of things, that God has to have maximum greatness, maximum knowledge, maximum power, maximum goodness, eternity, eternity exists, if it exists at all, eternally. Can't come into existence, can't go out of existence. We sometimes, they seem to be essential properties that would apply to God, but not to anything else. In fact, it's not hard to show that if God is a being, then none greater than which can be conceived, that there can only be one such being. There can't be more than one, and it's a tricky. I say tricky. I'm not excusing. I'm just takes it takes a little bit of logic to go through the steps from one point to another to prove that that there's a. In fact, I think I even in this particular article I even formulate a uniqueness proof as well, that maybe in more than one place actually. So I don't know if that's what you were getting at.
Sure, I think it's very helpful to say
Okay.
that this is not a matter of semantics. This is a
No,
matter of
no. I mean,
ontology.
in fact, even atheists, agnostics, any philosopher worth his or her philosophical reputation could agree, that the concept of God makes sense. Oppe, he's this great philosopher of religion from Australia, who has been critical of what I've written, has been critical of what lots of other people have written, but he's in search of the truth. That's my opinion. He sees it clearly, and it's just a question of who's ultimately right. And in fact, there is no. Well, the other interesting thing about philosophy is that the discussion never ends. There's no stopping point, and we listen with great care, and we try to learn from others, even if they disagree with us. And I think that's one of the things I'm trying to do here as well.
Yeah, I think you're doing a great job of it, Professor. I think one thing you said that I wanted to highlight for the listeners is that we're not talking about clever semantics. This is not an argument that was built on the back of someone having a gotcha moment because they formulated sentences in such a way that you couldn't argue your way out. Instead,
no.
We're describing a nature of reality that on the surface might seem like, oh, that's kind of a clever trick, but it's not a trick. It's if you properly understand what we mean when we say God, if you use that terminology precisely, that entails certain things that move you from a realm of possibility to actuality by necessity.
Yeah, and I think if there's one thing that I stress in this piece that I did for Blackwell Companion, it's that if you engage, we should engage very, very carefully, painfully so at times, in this analysis of the ideas and claims that are made in religion and in the philosophy of religion, and that's quite. And we can do that quite well, and we can communicate with each other, whether we're theists or atheists or deists or pantheists or whatever it is our particular persuasion might be. I like to say that for all the years I would teach, I would rarely tell my students what it was that I believed in the personal sense. So they came away not knowing whether I was a theist or an atheist or an agnostic. And I wanted them to think for themselves, and I was trying to teach them how to do that. One thing I want to call your attention to, this is an interesting one. You probably haven't seen this one before unless you, in fact, I was reminded of this if you were to go back up the page a little bit, John. All right, Oppe is essentially supernaturally unaccompanied being parody. Now, this was an interesting one. And I knew of it from years ago, but I forgot about it. And what Oppe is doing, he's arguing just like Anselm argued, just like Gonilio argued, but in the place of the word that than which nothing greater can be conceived, he puts the phrase that which is essentially supernaturally unaccompanied. Supernaturally unaccompanied, all right? So he goes through the say, he just substitutes that at that place in the argument where Anselm was referring to God, or Gonilio was referring to this perfect island. He substitutes this phrase, essentially supernaturally unaccompanied. And what's the logical conclusion? That an essentially supernaturally unaccompanied being exists. So what's a supernaturally unaccompanied being? It's a being that means if a supernaturally unaccompanied being exists, then there are no gods, there are no spiritual beings, there are no spooks, no ghosts, no angels, no devils, and the like. There's none of this. Gonilio adds another thing into the universe of discourse, if you will, namely this lost island, right? All right. So if you're right, Anselm, then we also have this lost island in existence. We proliferate the things that exist. Oppe takes it away. He said, if there's an essentially supernaturally unaccompanied being in existence, and that is in existence, if Anselm is right, he says, then God can exist. It doesn't exist at all, which is a very interesting application of that line of reasoning. The problem is for Oppe, and I've told him this, is that, look, your essentially supernaturally unaccompanied being is a material being by definition, virtually. It's supernaturally unaccompanied, essentially so, by definition, necessarily. Therefore, there ain't no gods around, if you will. Nothing like God. That's an interesting, I mean, that really throws down the gauntlet to the theist to either find something wrong with with the way Oppe puts it. If you, or give up your point of view, or give up your beliefs, basically. And that's a good reason to maybe study some of the logic that is necessary to see what's good and what's not good about some of these arguments. Anyway, as I told you, I then
and if I may, Professor, I think
why don't you jump in on that one, because I think that one's an interesting one. I don't think you might not go to sleep tonight thinking about that.
Well,
one.
I'm so just to make sure I'm tracking, an essentially supernaturally unaccompanied being would be a being that exists in a realm without any supernatural other beings, like it's just a purely material.
No other no partners, nothing else around that's supernatural. He or she or it is supernaturally unaccompanied.
Yeah, I think I really wrestle with the presuppositions there. I mean, I'm trying to look at this in an isolated way, but I think what's resisting, and I think some of the viewers who have been tracking with us as we've talked about cosmology and we've talked about some of the other pieces, would be able to readily recognize I don't currently affirm a theory that says you can have a realm of just material beings. that exist without any metaphysical intervention of some kind. And so I think I'm struggling to engage with it. I mean, I see where he says, well, what if we move it into the mind? Even then, I think I'm really wrestling with it, because it's like, well, even if I can conceptualize of such a realm, which I can.
You mean you can't think of a world that would be there were no spiritual beings?
But maybe I'm misunderstanding the spiritual
you
beings
can't think
part.
of one.
I can think of one where I could conceptualize of a purely
Right.
materialistic, but even so, maybe I'm misunderstanding spiritual. So we're saying there's no what we would call deities above, but then there's no eternally existing soul within either, right?
Right. Look, I mean, no, right. There's no. It's a world where there's no spiritual beings. There was no immaterial beings, such as God, such as God, or gods, or an angel, or angels, or anything like that. They would be. Everything that exists in that world would have to be supernaturally unaccompanied.
I guess my question though is like love and intellect and humor. Where do those fall? Because I know that like on a purely naturalistic sense, we talk about dendrites sending off impulses and those types of things.
Right.
I've heard arguments that that's different than the volitional acts of the will, that exists a level higher than the mechanical processes. So then are we talking about a world where there's not only no soul, but there's no intellect and there's no concept of love?
No. Of course, I mean, look, I mean, I can sit here and imagine that that there aren't any angels around anywhere. That doesn't mean that people don't. There aren't people, for example, who behave angelically. I can imagine that there are no bodiless, immaterial things, entities anywhere in the world. Even though there are lots of, that doesn't mean we don't, just because there are no angels, that doesn't mean there are no angelic individuals, it seems to me, who behave in an angelic way, or a loving way. By a spiritual being, I don't mean someone who, and I don't think Oppe means it either, someone who does not act spiritually. There are no ghosts, or Oppe calls them spooks. That these characters don't exist anywhere. They're materialist bodies or objects. But you can conceive of that, can't you?
So then, when he says we can conceive of an essentially supernaturally unaccompanied, he's saying we can conceptualize of a being in a realm where there's no unembodied supernatural forces at play.
Right. Yeah, he's saying they're supernaturally unaccompanied. That's all. That word ought to be hyphenated, maybe. Supernaturally unaccompanied. No, there are no such beings. And essentially so, he says.
Okay. And on his argument,
there's the rub, I think, right there. But because if everything exists is material, right, then it has limitations, because material things by nature have limitations. And therefore, some of the essential properties of and one of which is being material, is not great making. And if it's not great making, then one of the premises of the argument turns out to be false, of Oppe's parity. That's what I'm saying. But if the parity is right, if the parity, and look, what the ultimate purpose of parities in the first place, let's not lose sight of this, is not to prove that what the conclusion says is the case. It's to prove that the argument that said something like that was the case is not the case. The point of a parity, whether it's Oppe's or Gunilio's, is not to prove that there are only material objects in existence. The object of the parity is to prove that Anselm's proof of the existence of God is flawed. That's the purpose of the parity.
That's helpful.
And what I'm saying is that thanks, Oppe, for bringing this kind of parity to our attention, because it's forcing us to think a little bit about how it is we argue for what we believe in.
Interesting.
That's what I'm saying. And now, maybe that's a good reason for jumping forward a little bit to the back page here. I never intended for this hour session or so to be able to cover every argument that I discuss, or every counter argument to every argument, and counter arguments to the counter arguments what I discuss in this piece. I never intended to do that in this one session. But in about 2006 or so, somewhere right around that time, maybe a little earlier, I'm not sure, I published a piece in Philo, Philo. It's a journal of the philosophy of religion, committed as an editorial policy to an atheistic worldview. So I decided to send this argument, which I constructed, called the Modal Perfection argument. I said, I'm going to try. Why send it to a journal that has an editorial policy that might agree with what I'm saying in terms of the content of the argument? Namely, this is an argument designed to prove the existence of God, a being no greater than which can be conceived. I called him a supreme being. And I sent it to Philo, and lo and behold, they accepted it for publication. At first, when I first sent it to them, they rejected it. And the rejection was based upon, I think, by and large, a review that someone on the editorial board wrote of the argument, an analysis of it, pretty hefty analysis of it, which attempted to show I was all wrong. So I took up the task and replied to the so-called anonymous ref. And then I rewrote the paper with the ref's remarks in mind, and then sent it back to Philo for publication, to which they accepted it quickly. And then it was published. This argument, called the Modal Perfection argument, did not come to my mind in a vacuum. I had studied Anselm a bit. I had studied Descartes and Leibniz in great detail. I had studied Immanuel Kant in great detail. And then there were a number of ontological arguments in the 20th century, which I'd also studied in some detail. And I came across one day an argument that the greatest logician, perhaps of all time, certainly of the 20th century, is a mathematician by the name of Kurt Gödel, Godel. He is a mathematical logician, most famous of all for his proof that mathematics is what he called incomplete, meaning thereby that there are mathematical truths that cannot be proven from the truths of logic alone. And no matter how you try to beef up your mathematical assumptions, if you beef them up to the point that they remain consistent, there'll always be mathematical truths left over that you can't prove. Now, this was a remarkable finding in the 20th century. And that was just a sample of what, that's an idea, one thing that he proved. He proved so many other things, it blows your mind, that are profound. Anyway, he had this proof. He publishes a proof for the existence of God. It's an ontological like proof. And I call it Gödel's proof. It's not easy to read. In fact, he leaves a lot of blanks. And it turns out that the proof he wrote, that he discussed, as great a logician as he was, had its flaws. And I discussed some of these flaws in the article, and then point to other places in the article where you can learn more about it from other writers. A few people tried to repair Gödel's argument, and it was an argument for the existence of God, an ontological kind of argument. And it's listed in the piece here, in the chapter 10. Somewhere along the line, in thinking about his argument and in thinking about Anselm and Leibniz, I had this, I don't know, I called it insight that it could be abbreviated significantly and made wholesome. That is the girdle-like argument. And that's just the result. It only had 3 assumptions in it, 3 premises. First one says, a property is a perfection. Namely, it's a perfection being, remember, a property that's better to have than not, right? Like intelligence, goodness, power, being free, better to have than not. And the assumption is if you have if a property is a perfection, then its negation can't be a perfection. If intelligence is a perfection, then stupidity can't be one. If goodness is one, then evil can't be one. If power is a perfection, then weakness can't be one, and so on. So it would be better to be all those positive things. That was Gödel's terms, positive, and I call them perfections. And I said, if you put these 3 assumptions together, you can prove the existence of a supreme being. And by a supreme being, I now mean what Anselm meant, a being than which none greater can be conceived, or a being than which none more perfect can be conceived. It's a fairly detailed proof, but not impossible to comprehend or understand with a little bit of knowledge of contemporary logic. You can write it out without logic. It just takes a lot longer if you don't use mathematical symbolism and the like to do it. But that was what I called the modal perfection argument. And it seemed to take, and I actually also prove in that piece called the modal perfection argument, that the logic that I use to support it, although argued and contentious, it's a very strong system of modal logic, but one which has an awful lot of support among philosophers, regardless of their religious perspective or their point of view about arguments for the existence of God or otherwise. It's this strong system of logic seems to be the one that is most in vogue. And regardless of the philosophical persuasion of the philosopher in question. And I can also prove, using that same logic, that there's only one such supreme being. So when this came out, it did create some discussion, a lot of discussion for that matter. In fact, there was another whole book that was written, and I was asked to participate as one of the writers in it. It was called the Ontological Proofs Today. Ontological Proofs Today. And there was a major section of the book that consisted of a back and forth debate style argument between Oppe and me, which turned out to be quite interesting. At any rate, maybe I should stop right there before we go on to this other parody. Namely, it would be two other parodies of that argument, if you guys have time.
So I want to just real quick, for those of you who had just joined the call or have been listening to this entire conversation, this is the Reasonable Faith Monthly International Directors Book Study. The Reasonable Faith is an organization created by Dr. William Lane Craig, in which our goal is to bring an articulate, gracious conversation about things of the faith to the public circle. We operate in just about every country, and we are so thrilled to bring you such a fine thinker as Professor Maydole today. He has been walking us through the ontological argument, which is a very old argument that argues that if it's even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God exists once you understand this concept of what a maximally great being is. And Professor Maydole has recently formulated what he calls his modal perfection argument, which he believes enhances the discussion, which he's been sharing with us near the end of this call. Professor, I've been really enjoying this talk. In honor of time, I'll give Charles the leeway here to kind of speak through the timepiece just a bit, but I just want to say this has been so insightful. I loved seeing Oppe's parody. Thought that was really, really interesting. And I look forward to discussing this in the days to come. Please, Charles.
I'm good for time. It's up to you.
I'm good too.
You or yeah, okay.
All righty. Well, let's just keep moving through the rest of your material here, and I know our viewers are appreciating such a thorough treatment.
All right. Well, inasmuch as I thought it would be smart to maybe focus not so much on all the intricate proofs or reasons for believing the premises of the argument, but it would be useful to look at parodies, because if the parody is to determine whether the parody does indeed refute the entire argument, namely, and it will, if it's valid, like the original, and the original argument has to be valid or the argument is worthless anyway. And the premises of the parody are at least as justifiable as the way in which, as the premises of the original argument might be. That I thought that if we looked at these kinds of things, we would have a kind of a better feel for the importance of the argument, and as well as for the reasoning that goes into supporting the argument, because that same reasoning might well go into supporting the parody. So we better get the reasoning straight, or we're going to have to live with the view that maybe our argument is just significantly flawed, because that's what parodies are designed to do, to show that arguments that are just like them are flawed, because the parody is silly. We know that there aren't, we're pretty convinced that, as John's thought, there can't be these essentially supernatural unaccompanied beings around, and the like. So the question now becomes then, narrowly taking the narrower viewpoint, are there parodies that with respect to the modal perfection argument? And it's no surprise that people, in particular Oppe, who's the master of paradigm making, came up with some interesting parodies, and more than what I'm showing in the paper or in this handout. It was just too many limitations for me to include it all. So I tried to include some of the things that were a little bit more intuitive, easy to grasp, not less technical than some of the things that he comes up with, but he comes up with some really good ones. Now, the first one that I have here is not really, it's not really Oppe's in origin, but it seems to be just all pervasive. Everybody seems to be aware of this one. And I call it the most paltry being paradigm or parody. You might call it the devil parody. In other words, it's designed to show that there's a kind of a pretty paltry being out there somewhere or other, or a pretty evil being out there somewhere or other. And that's why I call it the paltry being parody. And it's just like the modal perfection argument. Just look at it. Just substitute the word imperfection for the word perfection. And then substitute the word where paltry is a being than which none greater can be conceived. All right, than which none, you could call it lesser than could be conceived. I think I don't think I included that on the handout. It might be there. A paltry would be where God is supposed to be the greatest possible being. This is supposed to be the least possible being in some form of it has the fewest number of great making properties associated with it. So that's the general idea. I wish I'd included that on the handout. Well, I do in a sense. I do in a sense that I refer to it. I do it in the second line in parentheses under the parody itself. I call it when I say something is most imperfect or paltry, if and only if it's not possible that something is not greater than it, and not possible that there isn't something else than which it is greater. So that would cover. It's not possible that there is something else than which it is greater. There's always going to be something else which is greater than the most imperfect being. Now the question is, does this really refute the modal perfection argument? My argument is, well, it would if all of its premises were as true as the premises of the modal perfection argument are true. And I have to give independent reasons for saying why that's the case, why they are true. And I do that at some length in the original Philo article, which I mentioned earlier, and in other places as well. And I don't spend as much time, although I do mention some reasons here in this Blackwell companion article for why these things might be true, why the premises of the modal perfection argument are true. But it seems to me there's one premise of the paltry being parody that is clearly false. And it's the first one. There are properties are in imperfection only if its negation is not. Well, there are lots of properties which are kind of neutral. And so you could say it's an imperfection, but its negation is also an imperfection. It's not a perfection. An imperfection is something that's not a perfection. So the property being red would be a good example. It's more like a neutral property. Neither it nor its negation is an imperfection. I mean, it is an imperfection, it's usually, but so is its negation, not neither nor, but both of them are. So the first premise would therefore be false, because the negation is an imperfection and redness is as well. So that falsifies the first premise of that argument. But I bring it up only because someone might be. I bring the paltry paradigm up for discussion only because some people might be willing to reject the modal perfection argument on the grounds of this parody of the paltriness. There's maybe I should stop right there for a second, and then before going on to this other one.
So interesting. I've been meditating on and reflecting on a comment you made earlier about how parodies are not designed in the traditional sense of argumentation to try to demonstrate soundness so much as they're trying to ridicule the lack of soundness of the argument that it's parodying.
Yeah.
And so to me, then, it would seem that if a parody fails to demonstrate soundness, then if a parody has been conducted well or built well,
Right.
based on the original argument, and it fails soundness, then that should entail that the original argument fails soundness. Is that how that goes? On the same basis?
The parody should fail almost by definition. That's what makes it it should fail. I mean, there's got to be something, since the conclusion is silly, in a good sense of the word silly. Since the conclusion is silly, it's absurd, if you will. It can't be. It can't be true. That means there's something wrong with the argument that made it seem as if it is true. One of the assumptions might be false. The argument might be invalid. And if you could point those things out, if you can identify where they are, then you've refuted the parody. If you can't do that, then you've essentially refuted the original argument. That's the point. In the case of the paltry parody, I bring it to your attention that I think that the first premise is clearly false. Where it's not clear to me that the first premise of the modal perfection argument is clearly false. In fact, I gave you some examples where it was obviously true. If you can come up with a counterexample, and I've had people try to do that from time to time, both professionally and just casually, I've always been able, I think, reasonably to counter them and say that there's something problematic there with what you're saying that attempts to falsify what I thought was true. They have a, but my point is, if you could point out that something wrong with the parody, then you can, at least for the time being, believe in the original argument for the, as long as it passes muster in all other ways. It doesn't beg the question, that is, assumes what it's trying to prove. It's valid, the premises are true or justifiable, and so on.
I see. So the parody must be defeated. It's another level of verification for the original argument.
If there's
if a parody is created, defeating it is another level of justification for the original argument.
Yeah, right, exactly. Defeating, well, absolutely. That's a good way of putting it. Because if you suppose you have an argument and it withstands the assault from different parodies, you got all these different parodies that are brought against it, and it survives the onslaught. That's reason to believe the argument is a compelling one.
Yeah,
for sure.
That makes sense. My only other question was, because that was very, very helpful how you illuminated that. Are you offering the modal perfection argument as a better case for God ontologically in an argumentation sense than the one that St. Anselm presented? Are you saying that this is a stronger ontological argument, or is it a complement to that?
I believe, that's a tough question to look, I think, Anselm's argument is more problematic than the modal perfection argument is. I think it's easier perhaps to, I think that No, you're asking me to, I think Anselm makes a good case, and you're asking me to rank these arguments as to which one is better than the other. I've made a case so far for saying that as hard as I've tried to refute Anselm, I've failed. Other people have tried to refute him, and I think that their refutations have failed too. And they try to do it by one of the ways of doing it is by constructing parodies. So I'm not saying the modal perfection argument is any better than Anselm. I think what it does is offer one more reason, among others, for believing that one can prove the existence of God. That's a better way, I think I'd rather put it than to say that this is better than Anselm's argument or better than Descartes' argument and the like. That one could, what's most interesting about this argument, the modal perfection argument, is the way in which it's done. It's a way in which I formulate it. It's not talking about the world. It's not talking about me and my ideas. It's simply talking about properties. It says a property is a perfection only if its negation is not. Properties, what the heck are properties? But we know things have properties. We all have properties. Everything has properties. No one wants to dispute that there are properties that things have. And I'm just saying that a certain kind of properties, Gödel said he called them positive properties. I think that was limited. But I say perfections are properties that are better to have than not. Man, I mean, and then I say, and they entail only perfections. In other words, if being intelligent, it implies, let's say, being able to understand with proper instruction basic arithmetic, then, and if intelligence is a perfection, then being able to understand basic arithmetic is a perfection. Agree. Amen. I agree. and then the property of being supreme is a perfection. Well, if that's not, what is? If to be supreme is to have it all. And if that's not a good and a perfection, then I don't know what is a perfection. So I think what I'm saying is this argument seems to bring less to the table, and I get a lot out of a little with this argument. So in that sense, I guess I would prefer it to some others that I've seen, and other arguments in the piece that I wrote certainly made it more complicated. There's one at the end of the argument, at the end of the chapter, called the temporal contingency argument, which isn't really, I put that in because Bill Craig asked me to. I had formulated this as a kind of cosmological argument at one time, but it's only a quasi-cosmological argument. In other words, it takes some hints from, and it has like 14 premises all about the world and things coming into existence and going out of existence and like, but I never make categorical statements about things coming into existence and going out of existence. And I said it's only possible. It's possible to do this and possible to do that and possible to do the following. And I had a whole bunch of these kind of interesting premises that are possible about the world. And from that set of possibility premises, I was able to conclude that it's possible for a supreme being to exist. And from that, I was able to infer that a supreme being does exist. But that argument is a bit more robust in the sense that it assumes so much more, at least in the realm of possibility, than the modal perfection argument assumes. So, and that's the reason I'm just as happy with holding on to the to the temporal contingency argument. That's the last one in this chapter. I'm just as happy to have that as the modal perfection argument or any of the others that I think are good. But I think it's the simplicity of the modal perfection argument, the beauty of it, the elegance of it that really jumps out at me when I look at it, even today. I was like, holy smoly, I got so much with so little.
Right.
I don't know how it came about, or except that there was historical, I read Gödel, and I knew there was something wrong with Gödel. I said, how could I make it better? And I thought I'd make it better. I have to add something to it. It turned out I had to make it better by taking something away. And then so that's where we are. There's a, you move the page, go down toward the bottom of the second page, John. There's the last one I talk about here in this handout is called Oppe's Supreme Island Parody. And those who have the handout can read what I've said at the bottom of it, but it's just like the modal perfection argument. Except that it substitutes the idea of island perfection for the idea of perfection. And that's an island perfection simply being one that it's better for islands to have than not. And it substitutes islands supremacy for general supremacy, namely an island is supreme just in case it's necessarily greater than any island, other than any other island. Nothing's greater than itself. So in that sense, it's kind of always be any other island. And it turns out that that this was a troubling one. I thought at first that this did refute the modal perfection argument, but the more I think about it, and the more I think about Oppe's responses, which I couldn't all list here, they fail. That the argument withstands the parody, because I think the parody is invalid, because it requires that something is necessarily an island in order for the logic requires that we assume that islands are necessarily islands. And I don't think that that's true at all. And that if equivalently, it requires that something that if something is possibly an island, then it must be one. So there's got these two rather strange, bizarre assumptions that have to be made, which, by the way, in the process changes the structure of the argument. You have to go ahead and assume that islands necessarily exist, or necessarily are what they are, namely islands. And this shows up if you study a little bit more in the logic of it. So I think that this parody fails as well. There's more about that story in the companion article. If one wants to read even more and in much greater depth, my recommendation to your crew would be to look at the discussion in Ontological Proofs Today. I'm holding the book up now to the camera. It's, I don't know what it's out, it might be out in paperback. It was, the editor was Miroslav Skatowski from Poland. But if you Google that idea, Ontological Proofs Today, that would come up. And there's a much deeper discussion back and forth between me and Oppe about things such as the Supreme Island Parody. I humbly think that Oppe's fails, but he might say otherwise. I'm sure. You got to be Charles or John or anyone else have any, if there's anyone listening, have any other questions about that, I'm happy to pursue it.
I'll be ruminating on this for a while.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
This is a big meal
Ah.
mentally. And so I will say that when I think of the three main lines of natural theology as it relates to things of theistic interest, philosophy, science, and history, I have often spent less time with complementing arguments for the more philosophical side of things. I think
Yes.
we've built up kind of a set of arguments for science, the philosophy of science, as it relates to natural theology, same for history. But I think that I haven't spent as much time. So it's nice to see complementing philosophical arguments for the nature of God. I haven't often seen those, or haven't, and full transparency is probably my fault more so than anything else. But I'm very pleased to now be able to sit with these arguments. I'm also very curious in this book you've referenced to our viewers on ontology, because I think an understanding of ontology and you know, obviously when we're surrounded by, or we're speaking to more of a lay audience, this issue of essence is a really important issue. It's a really important issue because a lot of times I think a lot of discussions, albeit not always theological in nature, get lost in semantics because we use terms equivocally. And it's like, no, you might see this term perfection and you might connote one thing or the other, but we're inviting you into a very rigorous analysis of these terms and the realities that they point to, regardless of how you feel about the conclusion. And that is a lost art, Professor. And so I'm very pleased with that whole setup. And as we come to the end of the time here, once again, these monthly installments, Charles Honeycutt has been such a huge help for setting these up. Professor Maydole is another just brilliant A-class thinker that we've brought on to share with us. He has done a great job, as all the other ones have, of showing us how much further we have to go in our studies. And yet he has done it with a great level of accessibility and personality. And so for that, I'm very thankful. Professor, closing words for you for us today, please, sir.
I think that I'm happy to have spent a lot of time on the ontological argument, because from this now I'm going to speak kind of personally. I think it's the one argument that, let me put it another way. I think that faith and science really are not enemies of each other, for sure. In fact, I think they complement each other. And I think, however, that natural science, I'm searching for the right word. I don't want to use the word Trump for political reasons. But I think that natural science trumps everything else. I think so, that we could probably get along well enough if we didn't believe in God's existence. Lots of people do, and far be it from me to say that, you know, that they shouldn't believe what they believe. But I think science is a way to objectively come at things. And if someone, for example, attempts to say, well, look, scientific theory says so and so, but I believe otherwise, therefore I'm going to reject science, I think that's very foolish. And Bill Craig is one who would agree with me, I think, on that. You've got to, you want to look at what science says, and you don't see it as flawless. You don't see it as the last word, because it's always changing. We never have the full truth. And what I like about ontological arguments is I don't conflict with science at all here. We're, as it were, proving things not based upon the way the world is, but how ideas and certain kind of abstractions interact with each other. So, I mean, that's one thing. I don't know if I put that well or poorly, but that's one of the reasons I like ontological arguments, because they don't conflict with science, and I'm very much a proponent of science myself and mathematics, and there's no conflict there. And so for example, let me give you a real life example. If talk about creation of the universe, if someone says that, I might disagree with Craig on this point. For example, that if one could argue, if one could come up with a particularly interesting and persuasive proof that for the existence of the universe, other than by appealing only to science, I'd say go for it. But that might give me trouble. As a believer, I believe one thing, but as a proponent of science, I would then be believing I'd be conflicted. I don't have that same problem with respect to ontological arguments, because they by nature don't conflict with scientific findings or proceedings or thinking.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. I think where I believe you're coming from, and where I could also agree with you, is that there are those of us that have been hardwired to think too much. And for those of us that have been hardwired to think too much, we become somewhat enthralled by information, by the process of science. There's a beauty to it, almost an art to it, almost the empirical, the historical, and the philosophical. And so in that, it's provocative, this idea that you could conceptualize of a world built of just scientific processes to the analytical mind is interesting. It's like, oh, okay, well, if you could successfully crack that code, that would be interesting, and I don't think, we would necessarily be opposed to that as critical thinkers. Obviously, there's, as you said, theistic complications, but I would agree with you in that, I think I can understand what you're saying, in the sense of you believe that the ontological argument circumvents that hairy back road and comes from a different angle, that allows for us to have a conversation apart from some of those controversial waters. I don't think you're saying it's disconnected as a whole from the conversation, but it allows us to start one in a little less controversial waters. I think that's very, very interesting. I hope our viewers also understand that to tell someone that if it's even possible that God exists, then it follows logically based off of what we mean by God, by the essence, by the necessity of God's nature, and what this maximally great being entails, and as Professor Maydole has talked about with this modal perfection, that God has to exist if you understand modal logic. This is a big deal. This is something to really wrestle with. This is either foolishness or world-changing, culture-shifting news, right? For some people. So, but it can't be something in between. So, Professor Maydole, Charles, if you could help me, I just really appreciate you taking the time to bear with us, and to take that towering intellect and bring it down for us. I think you did a great job with some of the flexibility you demonstrated today. Once again, thank you all for joining us for another monthly installment. You guys are doing great, surviving this journey with us. And we look forward to taking you guys on another one real soon with our next book that we're deciding on as a group. And we'll talk to you.